In December of last year, we here at EonsOfBattle made a very exciting terrain set in the Fall Part 1 buildings. And what made it so interesting was in the span of one day and a morning, with a little bit of help, I was able to build an entire 40k game board of big buildings, a big militarized city. And that militarization was shown off in sandbags and barbed wires and banners, but really the militarization aspect comes from the guns. And that's what we're doing this month, the guns. Some really, really big guns. Our big guns come in 3 flavors and 3 sizes, all meant to live within our battlement walls. The man-operated mortars are perfectly sized to slip into the eagle parapets, giving these fortifications a little extra defense. But for offense, the sun cannons shoot big bright balls of pure energy at any would-be invaders, whether on the ground or sniping ships at a low orbit. And speaking of low orbit, the big kahuna, the battle cannons. This guy is so big it has a foundation to house all the equipment needed to lob a 1,000-pound shell at the enemy. And you might have noticed these arch-shaped holes in the bunker walls. These fit a selection of shrines, doors, and control panels for decorating and adding some context to the weapons. All of this terrain is available on our website, EonsOfBattle.com, as of the month of January. New year, new terrain, and subscribers on our website, in addition to supporting us doing what we do, will be able to get this terrain at a discount using a credit. Otherwise, it'll be available to purchase as digital STLs. So why big guns as terrain? Well, guns are just awesome and fun, but number 2, I remember back in the Disney going to my friend's little game store and seeing some really, really cool terrain pieces that are guns. I'm thinking the Imperial Bastion with those heavy bolters sticking out of it all over the place, and the Eagle gun. I don't even know what it's called, but it's the big Eagle gun. It's really cool. I really like terrain that tells a story, and sure, you can just have your battlefield be a fight over a generic scrap of landscape, but I think it's a little bit more exciting to be fighting over a city, and a suitably grimdark city would be one city that is literally itself a weapon. I threw all this stuff onto a tray and blasted it all with black spray primer. I got lucky with a warm winter day, which sped things along nicely. Getting back inside, I put a mid-tone gray into my airbrush and gave all the parts zenithal, hitting them from above. It's always daunting to have a huge pile of bits in front of me, so I'm gonna start knocking things out section by section, starting with the shrines. I gave each piece a dry brushing of a warm gray color, and then I took a red-brown speed paint and glazed this over the lower half of each panel. Now to add a pop of color, I made up an orange wash. I mixed together some orange paint, flow aid, water, and matte medium. All of these goobs combined will make a paint that is flowy with enough thickness to stick around in the corners. I dripped this onto the panels, letting it flow into the cracks and crevices, and I layered this on really thick. I'm not the best at making homemade washes, and I find that they dull a lot once they're dry. And watching these parts dry, I noticed how perfect everything printed, and that is because it is printed in beautiful Soraya resin. Soraya resin is the best quality 3D printing resin, and we have a code for you guys. If you want to try it for yourself, use EonsOfBattle to get 8% off your order of Fast Navy Gray. After that, I gave these parts a sponging of silver paint to make it look like these are ultra grimy metal slabs, and I dry brushed some gold paint over the spikes on top. Then I started picking out some of the details like bone white over the candles and the literal bones of the skeleton caricatures. One is picking up a sword, readying himself for battle, and the other is wielding a shovel, preparing the defenses of the city. I hit all the candle wicks with a little yellow paint for the flickering flame, and on the little windows, I painted these as glowing red eyes. I'm not sure if these are crewed by humans or if there's a servitor crammed in there somewhere, but either way, they need to see out of it. Some of these panels have a computer screen, and my favorite recipe for sci-fi computer screens is a gray base coat, followed by scratchy white lines for the scrolling text across the screen, and then finishing it off with some Army Painter Ghillie Doo, the color of sci-fi. All the panels I need for this project are now done. I got all my little shrines done, and I got a little carried away picking out all of the little grim gothic goodies, but I couldn't help myself because it's giving me really strong Necromunda vibes. In fact, this set comes with a whole bunch of separate little skulls and candles to add to scenery and bases. Don't tell nobody, but I might be getting into Necromunda. I've been working on my Escher gang, and Santa brought me the Necromunda starter set. I'm pretty excited about that, and I think the scenery is going to work really well for both games. Now, my vision of the board that I want to build is kind of split right down the middle. I want it half city and then half the outskirts of the city. And so within the city walls, I want to have all of the buildings that I've built, and I want to have the really, really big guns. And I want it to be relatively nice, still grimdark and a little bit grimy, but then I want it separated by a wall. And then on the other side of that wall, I want it to be like the outskirts. And so I'm going to use my Mars mat, and I'm going to use all of my red, like prefab industrial Games Workshop terrain. And I'm going to use the plasma guns as the outer defenses. So now I got to paint those. These 4 cannons are all primed and zenithalled. Now I have to decide on a color. These are big, but not so big that they can't be moved around, so I want these to have a more military green to them. And to achieve that green, I'm actually going to be doing some undercoating. I started out airbrushing a tan color over my parts, and I poured some of this tan onto my palette and sponged this on to get some extra texture over top of the gradient my airbrush put down. Then I thinned down some army green speed paint and I airbrushed this over top. Speed paint through the airbrush works really well as a tint, and I can control how saturated it gets by how long I spray a certain area. Over the top half of each part, I just gave it a light dusting, and over the bottom half I really blasted it, so my buildings have a nice variation in finish. I took some of my original tan and sponged this on with a big sponge, so I got some bigger splotches and chips, and I did the same thing with a red-orange color to give the impression of some rust. Now for the metal parts. I took a dark brass color and used my large dry brush to base coat these. Using the dry brush on these base coats works much faster than a normal brush. I can really squish the paint into all the nooks and crannies. After those base coats were on, I washed out my dry brush and then used it for its intended purpose, dry brushing some gold over top of these brassy parts for a highlight. Now that the guns are nearing completion, I feel like they're calling out for a little bit more grime. I thinned down some of the speed paint I used over the shrines and glazed it here and there over the green armor of the guns. Now I need to figure out what color to make the plasma. Blue is the standard, and I've done chaotic pink before, but my guns are green. I feel like the complement orange will look especially vibrant. I airbrushed on some orange paint, dry brushed white to hit the ribbing, and then airbrushed some yellow contrast paint to tint the white into an ultra intense glow. And speaking of glow, I need to hit the surrounding gun with some orange to help sell the glow. Then I superglued these parts into place and I can finally glue on my shrine doors. I picked out the panels that have more utility and less decoration for these cannons. They're plasmas, they probably need a lot more tender loving care to get them to work properly. And these bits work alongside our plasma pipes. I painted all my pipes pink because that was the mood I was in that day. I might go back and change it all to orange one of these days so that they match. I've got the 4 plasma guns done, and plasma is something that is very unique to 40k. Well, not strictly like plasma guns, because every universe has its own energy weapon that shoots nebulous glowing energy. But a 40k plasma gun with the glowing coils and the fact that it's dangerous to the wielder is something that is very uniquely 40k. Even a lot of other guns from 40k have not reached the level of star power that is the plasma gun. How recognizable is the shuriken catapult, or the Gene Stealer called needle pistol, but the plasma gun is instantly recognizable. Although I would have to say, out of all plasma guns, my favorite plasma gun is the one from Fallout New Vegas, the plasma pistol. That is my all-time favorite gun. It is glorious. Every time I start a new game, I immediately go straight for Novak and the Repcon test site so that I can get the pistol. And then a lot of the merchants, you can find the mods early on, so you can get it to like 35 base damage before level 10. It's fantastic. But now I must put away the plasma so that I can work on the more direct fire weapons. I have 2 of these big old blasters, and for paint, I went green on the plasma guns, but for these fellas, I'm feeling more blue, like my original walls and neoprene matte. Once again, I'm gonna use undercoating to get the look I'm after. I airbrushed light gray over these parts, hitting the center of each gun ball, and then reinforcing the zenithal on the base, pouring out the extra paint from my airbrush cup, and then sponging this on everywhere for texture. Now for some more base coating, and once again, I'm using my dry brush for the base coating. All these little spikes would make it really tricky to get in there with a normal brush, but the millions of bristles in a dry brush knocked it out in record time. I also hit part of the support columns with this dark brass color to bring some of the gold onto the bottom half of the cannons. I dry brushed gold over all the brass parts. I switched to a dry brush with long bristles for this so I could target the top half of each support bracket, leaving the bottom mostly brass. And now to make these cannons blue. I thinned some dark blue speed paint way down so that it would just tint what's underneath, and I brushed this over all the gray. I didn't make up quite enough of this color, but it worked out fine because I did what I could with the blue, and then I filled in the gaps with the brown speed paint, which I blended together to make the walls look dirty in some places. I love how my round cannons look. The cherry on top was adding a little bit of verdigris to the gold to make the gold look a little bit more cold and grim. I used up the last of my shrines, filling in all the arches for my cannons using the skelly statues. Look at these friendly little fellas. Is it macabre that the guns have skeletons on them? Yes, but that's how my Imperial citizens like it. These are some really, really big guns. There's an amazing story, I wanna say it was in the 5th edition Tyranid Codex, of gigantic guns like this absolutely decimating wave after wave of Tyranids. And so they take the gargoyles, impossibly large flocks of gargoyles, fly into the cannons, and they fly down the cannons' barrels to clog them in order to stop the cannons firing and let the Tyranids continue their advance. Which that story also solidifies for me the idea that the Tyranid are actually the robot faction in 40k. They use their different biomorphs to solve different problems, and the Necrons are actually the alien faction in 40k. Now that I got the big old guns done, it's time to work on the little guns. But they're not that little. These mortars are about the size of 3 men and can probably do some serious damage, but in the world of 40k, most of the big bads can probably just shrug off the damage inflicted by these cannons. Really, they're just for softening up the squishier targets so the big guns can finish them off. I gave these cannons a stripe of white paint with my airbrush, going right up the barrel like I would if I was trying to paint these with non-metallic metals. And I glued on all the robot hand loaders. All the crew has to do is aim the cannon and keep the robot arms fed with fresh ammo. I thinned down some yellow-brown speed paint and put this over the frame and pistons of the cannons, and the same blue I used on the big guns for the barrel. Now for a little dry brushing. I put white paint over the barrel, sweeping my brush lengthwise over the cannon to hit all the rivets, segments, and scratches, and I made up a yellow tan for over the frame. This dry brushing over the speed paint was super quick, and I finished all these guns with a scribbling a yellow text on the side, like a warning label. It probably reads front towards enemy, just so the guardsmen don't get confused. With 10 mortars done, I have a table's worth of big old guns, and it is time to assemble the board and see what the Fall Part 1 and 2 look like together. It's just like how I envisioned it. I mean, this isn't the most practical board setup in the world. The shapes of these buildings and guns is designed around the Pariah Nexus Tournament Companion to give you the absolute perfect terrain layouts, but I want to play at least a few games like this, where it looks like something out of one of the novels. Caiaphas Cain would be right, well, Caiaphas Cain would be back here hiding, but like I can see the survivors on the battlement walls battling the onslaught of whatever is coming out of the red, rusty Martian landscape. Oh, and these guns. These guns don't necessarily have rules, although I can think of a few that I would write for them. It would make for a fairly one-sided game, although, what if it was, you've got a certain list ready to go manning the battlements, and then you have to defend against infinite waves of whatever is coming from this side of the board. That would actually make for a pretty darn interesting game. Ooh, and I probably have enough Necrons, and my Necrons are actually based on orange bases, so it could be super thematic. Ooh, this is really getting the creative juices flowing. All of these new guns are available on our website as of the month of January, as are the buildings that they are standing upon. Just seeing this setup is giving me some new ideas of some more buildings that I want to make to kind of facilitate this style of game board. I gotta get some more games in.